So, where did all this money come from? Because we've got the original house here without the pillars, then suddenly we've got this, and the servants' quarters, and the farm. 1744 to 1748. All came from George. Anybody heard of Admiral George Anson? Absolutely wonderful, brilliant man, and excuse me, I do not know why we don't shout about him from the treetops and plaster him all over everywhere, historically speaking, because we ought to do, we should do, because he's a very, very, very important man in our history. So George grew up at Shugborough. He was born at Shugborough, grew up at Shugborough along with his brother and sisters. And at the age of 14, he'd been reading in the library because he'd had a good education. But he wasn't the firstborn, so he knew he was never going to inherit. And unless his brother died, which he didn't want because he loved his brother. So he decided to carve a career for himself in the Navy. And he'd read about the travels. There were travel books at Shugborough, such as they were back in those days. Not much was known about the great big outside world, especially abroad. But what he'd read fascinated him. Mostly the sea. He wanted to go to sea. All he could think about was the sea, because we're about as far away from the sea, not far from this spot, aren't we? About as far away from the sea in any direction as you can get in this part of the country. And he read about the sea and thought, that's the life for me. And instead of going in as a commissioned officer, a little bit older, he was having none of that, he decided at the age of 14, a very young age, isn't it, to go and stand on the Chatham docks and go on board a ship called the Ruby as a volunteer. Can you imagine back in those days, being a volunteer? Not only was he a volunteer, so he'd join on board ship with all the others who just wanted a decent meal and perhaps get a share of the booty, because there was no proper Royal Navy back in those days. There was a Royal Navy, but it certainly wasn't like it is today. It was rather somewhat disorganised. And there was a lot of embezzlement and wrongdoing going on inside the forces, the army as well. The money was not being spent on what it should be spent on, and therefore the people who joined up were not always fully trained or clothed or whatever. But he decided he was going in as a volunteer to such a sort of ramshackle organisation as it was back then. And he completely, by the end of his career, had transformed the entire Navy. I'll start to tell you, I'll try and keep it brief, because I could do just one talk all about Admiral George Anson, but I'll try not to. I'll try and keep it fairly brief. But in order to do him justice, I have to tell you the following. He was, can you imagine him joining on board ship? He would be a bit posh, well-dressed, maybe, have a nice voice, and certainly wasn't starving, and he was well-educated. Can you imagine the others, especially as he was only 14, taking the mickey out of him? They'd be tempted to, wouldn't they? But they wouldn't have got very far, because even at the age of 14, he had been brought up to be a gentleman's son, and quite commanding. I don't mean he was bossy at the age of 14, but if picked on, could certainly have defended himself. And he was used to giving the servants orders, so that's where he would have started his, this kind of way of life. So he would have defended himself and was immediately put into the captain's cabin, because he could read, write and do a chart. He knew his numbers. So straight away he started to go up the ladder. He wasn't a cabin boy for very long. By the age of 19 he was acting captain. By the age of 22 he was captain for properly, and then he went right up the ladder to the top. By the time he was in his late 40s, he was First Lord of the Admiralty. And it's because of the following that I'm going to tell you. The following story that he knew all about the Navy, all about the ships, and all about the way it needed to be organised better. And he was commissioned to do that after this incident that I'm going to tell you. But first, let's have a look at what he did through his life. Towards the end of his career, he stamped out all the embezzlement and built 140 warships. Those warships were all the same. So you've heard the expression jumping ship. Well, the sailors could go from one ship to another and know exactly where everything was. Didn't matter what ship you were in. It's a bit like being in an Aldi shop, isn't it? You know exactly where everything is, or a Tesco shop. You know exactly where everything is. He designed, so the uniform that you saw him in, he designed that, and that's what that painting was all about. And there are lots of paintings, or there were lots of paintings of him in and around Shugborough as you go round the house. That one used to be over the mantel in the dining room. And that's what it was all about. Beg pardon, no, there was another one of him there, and that one was in the library, I think. But anyway, there's quite a few paintings of him in this uniform, and that's why, because he had it designed. He crippled the French Navy in 1747, put them out of the water completely. The new ships, they just couldn't compete with him. No way. He was a brilliant strategist, so he could plan a battle. And he took £2 million from those ships, which was bound for the Canadian, I think it was Canadian Army, or the French, the French Canadians, I'm trying to say. And of course they didn't get paid, so they were not very pleased. He saved the East India Company because they were constantly being attacked. And the goods were being either taken, robbed, or sunk, one or the other. And he has been hailed as the father of the British Navy, so very important person. But now I'm going to tell you about what happened just before the money came. So this is where the money came from, to rebuild Shugborough. He set out in a ship called HMS Centurion, and the king had commissioned him to, now what were the exact words? To harass the Spanish Navy. Isn't that wonderful? What does that mean? How do you harass? Oi, you there. You know, is that harassment? Does that class as harassment? No, of course it isn't. He was to try and put them out of business, because they were making far too good a living at that time, going around the, going to the South Americas and robbing gold from the Incas. Yeah? And they were quite brutal. The Incas could be brutal, but my golly, the Spanish were very brutal indeed. And they had swords, and I don't think the Incas did. Not in this. They weren't armed in the same way as the Spanish were. And they were taking these huge ships full of gold back to Spain, pretty much unchallenged. And if you read further into harass the Spanish Navy, he was to take some of the ports out as well, some of the trading ports that the Spanish had set up. So quite a good, quite an important job, a good job, an important job. And he set out in 4 years before, so 1736. Yeah, so he set out more or less 1736 and was at sea for 4 years. And he was quite successful in some ways, but quite unsuccessful in others. But the story has a good ending. He set off with 8 ships and roughly 1,300 men spread amongst those ships, and after only a couple of years, unfortunately, he lost most of those ships and most of the men. Awful, isn't it? They died of scurvy, dysentery, diseases, and all kinds of other things. And I'm not going to go too much into that. And he got to a point where he had to scuttle the Gloucester, the ship called the Gloucester, because there were not enough men on board to sail. There were 2 ships left. the Centurion and the Gloucester, and he took the men on board the Centurion so that they could continue their journey. And he had tried to get the gold off 2 other Spanish galleons and failed, because he'd aimed the cannons too low. So if we look here, he'd been aiming the cannons across, or down rather, instead of across, because he didn't want to kill too many men. That's the kind of person he was. Not to kill the men. But unfortunately those ships had sunk. If he'd aimed at the cannons more straight, it would have gone through the ship that way and not sunk it. So he this time decided he was going to shoot the cannons straight, and killing quite a lot of the Spanish men. But there were only 200 men on board George's ship and 600 men on board the Spanish ship. I'm going to tell you why and how George attacked it. He got so few men, he scuttled the Gloucester, and they went to an island in the South China Seas called Tinian Island, because they'd got no food, no fresh water, and the men were dying of scurvy and dysentery. I thought scurvy was just a bit of, but when you read, it's a horrific disease, and it's caused by a lack of vitamin C. So we found out about this because of George's journals. He kept a journal every day and wrote in this journal. And when he came home, these journals were published. There were 13 volumes. They kept selling out and selling out and selling out. And I think this is where all the stories come from. Stories such as the film, the Johnny Depp films, and other films, swashbuckling films. I think this is where these stories have been inspired from George's journals. So they were on this island. They managed to get fresh water, managed to find food. Something called the breadfruit tree sustained them, and they managed to load the ship up with some food and set back into the sea. And George had decided, without telling the men, that they'd had such a miserable few years at this point, that they were going to go home come home to us, to Britain, because he'd been so unlucky. He thought, next time I might not be so lucky, yeah? And they went around one of these capes, and in the distance, this was the same time as he was thinking, I'm going to give up and go back to England, that he saw the ship, the Covadonga ship, the one on the right, in the distance. And he knew that from the way it was in the water, it was listing heavily from left to right, that it must be heavily laden with gold. So he decided to chase it, and of course his ship had got only 200 men on board, so not a lot of weight, not a lot of food, not a lot of provisions. So he was light in the water, so to speak. And he got up alongside it, and within 3/4 of an hour, the cannon fire stopped and the white flag came out. The Spanish put the white flag out. So George is thinking, is this some kind of a trap? What's happening here? And it wasn't a trap at all. They'd run out of ammunition. They were so heavily laden with gold that they decided to ditch some of the ammunition and put more gold on board, because they were greedy, as you do. You get greedy, don't you? If you start dipping your hand into something and it's easy to come by, you start to get greedy, don't you? I'll have a bit more and I'll have a bit more. And they weren't expecting to be attacked. So, time's starting to get short. So I'm going to start cutting the story a little bit shorter. He towed the ship to the port of Canton, where he eventually managed to procure lots of provisions. Initially the Viceroy of Canton said, no, I'm not giving you any provisions to go back to England. Eat your gold, yeah? Instead of which, there was a fire in the docks, and George's men put the fire out. All very swashbuckling stuff, isn't it? But it's all true. And the Viceroy was very grateful and literally filled George's ship He'd taken the gold off, obviously, and sold the Spanish ship, the Covadonga. He'd sold it for $12,000. That's where George made his money. He became a billionaire, because I said about him taking all the French ships out of the water, he would sell them. He sold all the ships. And this was at a time when all of Europe was at war with the rest of Europe. Yeah? All of Europe. We were all at war with one another, all the countries in Europe. So the Dutch couldn't wait to get their hands on a Spanish warship, because they wanted to know how it worked and what it was like. He sold that very quickly and came back to England with the gold and all the provisions. During this time, because I thought it only took a few days to fill a ship up back in those days, no, it takes weeks if not months. You have to start with the things that will keep first, and slowly, and you end up by putting the live animals, because they carried live animals, and the water last. So things like sherry and wine and beer and things like that would go on first, and anything else that would keep. And then last of all, tea as well, tea and rice. He traded tea and rice. So he sold ships and traded tea and rice. But what I'm going to tell you will shock you quite a bit. The mayor of Canton also had these dinner service made, which is the breadfruit tree in the middle there. So it's all about George's journey, leaving England, going around the world and coming back again. Lovely, isn't it? Taken from lots of drawings that one of the men had done on board ship. And this can still be seen, or it could the last time I went to Sudbury, you can still see it. Take a look at this as well. When Thomas saw all these plates and saw this design on it, he decided to build one of those at the back, just by the river there. Remember seeing that as you've walked around?
Yeah.
That's what that's all about. It's taken from the Armorial Dinner Service. So let's move on. Came back to England, did George, with a ship full of gold, and that gold was worth £140 million. That was in today's money, not back then. But it was hundreds of thousands of pounds back then. And it took 32 carriages to take the gold back to London, to the king, because it belonged to the king. The ships were George's to do what he liked with, but the gold belonged to the king. But the king rewarded George with approximately £40 million. What a lot of money. And he was already selling ships and selling tea and rice and coffee and all kinds of weird and wonderful things that we take for granted today from abroad. He went on to do all the things that I have told you about. But he brought the £40 million back to Sudbury and gave it to his brother. And in due course, Thomas did all the building that I showed you. So he had all that money to do all that building with, and he was also rich enough then to become an MP. So there goes the story. Now let's get on, I'll talk about the family now. So we then start to bring into focus the Sudbury we know today, don't we? He also brought back with him many, many artifacts from China, from that area, from Asia, which were all at Sudbury. Do you remember walking around and seeing big China vases and Chinese this and Japanese that? Well, they were all brought back by George in the 1700s. So 1744 to 1748, Thomas is busy rebuilding Sudbury, shall we say, and George had got married. He was in his late 40s when he got married, and was climbing towards First Lord of the Admiralty. And he could have had his pick of women. Women loved him. But he decided not to get married. Not because he didn't like, but he loved women, and women loved him. And I'm sure there were a few little Georges around the world. But we won't go into that. But he hadn't got married because he said he didn't find anybody that suited him like this woman did. He met Lady Elizabeth York through the Navy, so she was the daughter of one of the other admirals, and he said she was his intellectual equal. Isn't that lovely? It's another reason I love George. He couldn't have married anybody who he couldn't have a conversation with. Yeah. Now, I get where he's coming from with that, because I couldn't have. I like to have a conversation with my husband. Yeah. I know what he means, in other words. And yes, we know she's very beautiful as well. So he was lucky, wasn't he, to find a woman. He fell madly in love with her for her looks, but also he could have an intellectual conversation with her. Now, they have no children. Thomas never married. So how did the family continue? Well, I'm going to give you brains a quick rest, and I'm going to give you a very quick guided tour, and then I'll finish the family history off. Because, believe it or not, we've only got 10 minutes left. I can't believe it. So, you go into Shugborough, and there's the round room at the front there. Then you turn right and you go into what's called the bust parlour. And it used to be full of busts. That's why it was called the bust parlour. Heads and shoulders, you know, all over it. But they were sold They were sold a bit later on. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But has anybody heard about the tunnels at Shugborough? Yeah? So you think there are tunnels at Shugborough? You're right. So down the stairs, so we'll go back a step. This here is the proper doors, the real doors. This here has brick, those have bricks behind them, those doors, they're not real. It's just made to balance, yeah? So you open these doors here, and you go down the stairs. On our last day, before we were made redundant, we were given free rein, and I just wandered around and took photographs of whatever I wanted to. So this was part of that photographic session. So you go down the steps, and you turn left, and you turn right, and those are the tunnels at Shugborough, all underneath the house. So there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 stories. If you count the underground, there's 4 stories to Shugborough. Just thought that was interesting. And this, of course, is where the servants would bring the food through, and they would take them back up those steps and into the dining room later on. So this wasn't a dining room originally, it was a sitting room, and Thomas had it made as a sitting room. But later on, because of the size of it, it was turned into a dining room. But this is George in his Viscount's clothes. He was made Viscount when he came back from his epic journey, his 4-year journey. And these paintings were by Nicholas Dore, and they're all about the ruins of Italy. So Thomas could sit in the sitting room and look, be in Rome, or in Italy, if you like. And that's why he did it. Lovely, isn't it? Was it Christmas? Gorgeous. And that's the ceiling, which I haven't got time to talk about. Took years, 4 years to create the ceiling. Beautiful. The family crest. It's not a very good photo, because it's one of mine. And so I've put this in. That's much clearer. And this is it was changed after George. So the family crest, the seahorse, and the crown, because he was made a Viscount, and the lion for strength, farming, because by this time Thomas had created a really good farm, and had started to make steps to be an MP, so that's about politics. So you've got it all there, haven't you? You've got the crown, you've got the seahorse, you've got the lion for strength, you've got farming, and you've got politics. It's all there. And nil desperandum, which is how I feel most days. But we won't talk about that.